I caught my younger sister making out with my boyfriend, just a week before her wedding. I spilled the beans to her fiancé. I figured he'd brushed it off. Turns out he dropped a bombshell at the wedding. At 28, I found myself tangled in a messy situation with my 26-year-old sister and my 29-year-old boyfriend. My sister's big day was coming up quick, and I started noticing her acting weird around my man. At first, it wasn't anything obvious, just these tiny, subtle things that made me feel a bit off. It all started with seemingly harmless comments, like my sister often gushing, "Wow, you're hilarious," to my boyfriend's jokes, even the not-so-funny ones. She'd be way too enthusiastic, laughing at everything he said. Initially, I tried to ignore it, figuring she was just being extra friendly because of all the wedding buzz. But as time went on, I started picking up on more worrying signs. She'd find ways to casually touch him, like resting her hand on his arm during chats or accidentally bumping into him. These little moves were subtle, but definitely there. I also caught her staring at him a beat too long when he wasn't paying attention, which made my stomach twist with unease. One night, after a family dinner where my sister had been super flirty, I decided to bring it up with my boyfriend. I turned to him and asked, "Did you see how Sarah was acting tonight?" He gave me a puzzled look and said, "What are you getting at?" I laid out all the stuff I'd noticed. The over-the-top laughter, the unnecessary touching, the lingering looks. He heard me out, but after a moment he just shrugged and said, "I think you're reading too much into it. She's probably just hyped about the wedding. It's no big deal." Even though he tried to reassure me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was up. It definitely didn't feel harmless to me. Despite my boyfriend trying to calm me down, I couldn't shake off this nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. So, I made up my mind to keep a closer watch, hoping I was just being paranoid and that my doubts were all in my head. But the next few weeks were super stressful. Every time we were with my sister, I'd be watching her like a hawk, picking up on every little thing she did. It became obvious she was always trying to get close to my boyfriend. She'd snag the seat next to him whenever she got the chance, and she seemed to have endless reasons to ask for his help with wedding stuff, even when I was right there. One day, we were all hanging out at my parents' place for a family barbecue. At one point, I ducked inside to use the restroom, and when I came back, I saw something that made my heart drop. My sister and my boyfriend were huddled together in a corner of the yard, talking quietly and standing way too close for comfort. My sister was giggling at something he said, a sound that made my stomach churn. The second they saw me, they quickly moved apart, and my sister walked off like nothing had happened. I felt a rush of nausea and anger, but I decided not to make a scene right there at the family gathering. Instead, I waited until we got home that night. When we were alone, I tried to bring up the subject as calmly as I could. I asked my boyfriend what he and my sister had been chatting about earlier. He seemed surprised by my question and said they were just going over some wedding details like the playlist. His answer didn't sit well with me. I couldn't understand why such a basic conversation needed them to stand so close. He sighed, clearly annoyed, and tried to wave off my concerns. He swore up and down that nothing was going on, insisting that my sister was just being friendly. But by this point, I couldn't bottle up my feelings any longer. I let my frustration out, pointing out that my sister was practically throwing herself at him, and he wasn't doing a thing to stop it. My words seemed to hit a nerve, and he looked at me with this pained expression, asking what I expected him to do. He reminded me that she was my sister and he was just trying to be nice. Telling her to back off seemed totally out of the question for him. I told him he could at least draw some lines, making it clear he wasn't interested in anything beyond a friendly vibe. But he kept insisting he wasn't into her at all, claiming there was nothing to make clear because I was imagining problems that weren't there. Our talk went round and round, with neither of us willing to budge, leaving us both annoyed and clueless about what to do. After arguing for a while with no solution in sight, it was obvious our talk was hitting a dead end. My boyfriend wouldn't stop insisting I was just seeing things, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get him to see what was so clear to me. In the end, we both went to bed feeling mad and frustrated, with the problem still hanging in the air. The next day, I knew I had to talk to my sister directly. It was obvious that dodging the issue was only making things worse. So, I decided to give her a call and ask if she wanted to grab coffee. She agreed right away, her voice all cheerful and seemingly clueless about my growing worries. We planned to meet at a little cafe close to her place. When we met up, I was a nervous wreck, my hands shaking a bit as I stirred my coffee. My sister, on the other hand, was all smiles, chatting away about her wedding plans. She seemed totally unaware of my discomfort, which just made the whole thing even harder for me. After listening to her for a few minutes, I realized I couldn't keep it in any longer. I cut her off mid-sentence, my voice showing just how serious I was about to get. I told her we had something major to talk about. My sister, totally caught off guard by the sudden change in tone, looked at me surprised and asked what was up. Taking a deep breath to calm myself, I started to explain. I told her I'd noticed how she'd been acting around Tom, my boyfriend, and that it was really bothering me. I brought up the flirting, the casual touching, and the long looks stuff that had been bugging me for a while. I made it clear that her behavior had to stop. As I talked, I watched her face go through a whole bunch of emotions. First there was surprise, then confusion, and finally anger. She demanded to know what I was on about, totally denying that she'd been flirting with Tom at all. I stood my ground, insisting that she had been, whether she knew it or not. I explained that her actions weren't just out of line, but they were also causing me a ton of stress. She laughed it off, but it was far from a real laugh. She told me I was being crazy, brushing off my concerns by saying Tom was practically family and she was just being friendly. But her words did nothing to ease the tension, and I could tell this talk had hit a sore spot. As I sat there, it was clear this wasn't going to be an easy fix, and the gap between us was probably just going to get bigger. I couldn't hold back anymore and let out all my frustrations, pointing out it was way more than just being friendly. I explained she was always finding reasons to be near my boyfriend, to touch him, and to laugh at all his jokes, even the lame ones. To me, it was obvious what she was up to, and it was making me more and more uneasy. As I spoke, I could see her face turning bright red with anger and disbelief. She was clearly shocked by my accusations, especially so close to her wedding. She fired back with a sharp comment, questioning my self-esteem and suggesting I must be really insecure to accuse her of such a thing. Her words stung, but I knew I had to stick to my guns. I tried to explain that my worries weren't about being insecure, but about respect. I told her she was crossing a line that shouldn't be crossed, and that her actions needed to end right away. Suddenly, she jumped up, her chair making a loud noise against the floor, signaling the end of our chat. She announced she wasn't going to sit there and listen to what she thought were paranoid and ridiculous accusations. She made it clear that if I couldn't trust my own sister, then that was my issue, not hers. With that, she stormed out of the cafe, leaving me alone with a whirlwind of emotions. I felt terrible and started doubting myself. Had I blown things out of proportion? Was I really just being paranoid? When I got home, my boyfriend immediately saw something was wrong. He asked me what had happened, and I retold the conversation I just had with my sister. As I shared the details, I could see the worry growing on his face. When I finished, he let out a heavy sigh and told me he thought I'd messed up big time. He was concerned that Sarah would be really hurt, especially with her wedding just around the corner. Feeling defensive, I asked him if he was on her side. He quickly reassured me he wasn't picking sides, but he voiced his doubts that Sarah had been hitting on him. Even if she had been, which he thought was unlikely, he felt that confronting her so directly wasn't the smartest move. His words left me feeling even more confused, not sure if I'd done the right thing or not. As tears started welling up, I couldn't help but ask, so what was I supposed to do? Just let it slide? The frustration and hurt were obvious in my voice. Sensing my distress, my boyfriend came over and gently put his arms around me. He suggested that maybe I could have handled things differently, that maybe I could have talked to him more about it first, or approached Sarah in a less in-your-face way. He expressed concern that now, with how things had blown up, Sarah was probably upset with both of us, and this could cast a dark cloud over her upcoming wedding, making everything super awkward. Feeling overwhelmed, I pulled away from his hug and questioned him. So, this is all my fault? I needed to know if he really thought I was to blame for the whole mess. He sighed deeply, clearly struggling to find the right words, and explained that he didn't mean to put all the blame on me. However, he did think I might have overreacted, letting my emotions run wild. We kept arguing for a bit, but it was clear we weren't going to see eye to eye. There was a total disconnect in our views, and neither of us seemed willing to fully get where the other was coming from. Eventually, he decided to hit the hay, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts and doubts. The following days were filled with tension. My sister had completely stopped talking to me, creating a painful rift between us. My parents, having picked up on Sarah's distress, called me, wanting to know why she was so upset. I tried to explain the situation to them, but I could tell from their reactions that they also thought I'd overreacted. As the wedding day got closer, I found myself more and more unsure about what to do. I was supposed to be a bridesmaid, a big role that now felt more like a weight around my neck. I wasn't even sure if Sarah still wanted me to be a part of her big day. My boyfriend, on the other hand, was still invited, and he suggested we both go to show there were no hard feelings. But the thought of standing there, watching my sister walk down the aisle while knowing how angry and hurt she was, made me feel sick to my stomach. The whole situation had become a tangled mess, and I didn't know how to fix it without causing even more hurt. Several times I tried calling Sarah, but she didn't pick up. She never replied to my voicemails apologizing and saying we needed to talk. I even went to her apartment, but she shut the door in my face. My anxiety went through the roof as the wedding day approached. Even though I wasn't sure, my partner kept telling me to let it go, that everything would be okay. In a dream, I showed up at the wedding, and everyone turned to stare at me, pointing and whispering. I woke up in a cold sweat. After the blow-up with Sarah, things went downhill fast. When she told our mom about my accusations, she hit the roof. She called me, screaming about how I could be so selfish and cause drama right before Sarah's wedding. She yelled, "How could you accuse your own sister of something like that?" She wouldn't listen when I tried to explain my side of things. She told me to fix this problem immediately and apologize to Sarah. The stress on our family was unbearable. Sarah still wouldn't talk to me, and now my parents were mad at me too. Tom, my partner, kept insisting I was making a big deal out of nothing, which just made me feel more depressed and annoyed. I went to my parents' place to try and smooth things over a week before the wedding. I heard hushed voices coming from the side of the house as I approached the front door. Curious, I walked over to the garden and froze, shocked by what I saw. Sarah and Tom were hidden behind a large plant, locked in a passionate embrace, kissing intensely. Sarah's legs were wrapped around Tom's waist. His hand was under her shirt. They were so caught up in each other that they didn't even notice me standing there. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. All the air left my lungs, and for a moment I couldn't move or speak. As the reality of what I was seeing sunk in, a powerful wave of anger and betrayal washed over me. My emotions took over and I found myself screaming, "What the hell is going on?" My voice shook, thick with the intensity of what I was feeling. The reaction from both of them was instant. My sister and my boyfriend jumped apart, their guilty faces giving them away completely. Sarah's face turned white as a sheet, realizing she'd been caught, while Tom fumbled for words, stammering, "It's not what it looks like." But it was exactly what it looked like, confirming every fear and suspicion that had been eating at me. Tears started pouring down my face as I choked out, "How could you? My own sister and my boyfriend." The pain in my voice was obvious. Sarah started crying too, her voice trembling with regret as she tried to apologize. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed, struggling to explain. "We didn't mean for this to happen." But I couldn't stand to hear any of their excuses. The betrayal was too deep, too raw. Without another word, I turned and ran, racing back to my car. Their desperate calls for me to come back fell on deaf ears as I drove off, my mind spinning with disbelief and hurt. As I sped away, my phone started ringing nonstop. First Tom, then Sarah, and finally my mom. I couldn't bring myself to answer any of them. The pain was too fresh, too overwhelming. When I finally got home, I felt numb. I immediately packed a bag with some clothes and the essentials I'd need for a few days. I couldn't stay here, not after what had just happened. I sent Tom a final text message simply saying, "We're over. Don't contact me again." Then I turned off my phone, cutting off any further communication, and left. Now I'm writing this from a hotel room in a nearby city, not sure what my next move should be. With the wedding just days away, I know there's no way I can go. My relationship is shattered, and the bond one once had with my sister might be broken beyond repair because of this betrayal. Feels like my whole world has been flipped upside down. Everyone made me feel like I was crazy for suspecting something was wrong, but in the end I was right all along. The pain of that realization is almost too much to handle, and I find myself wondering how I'll ever be able to trust anyone again after this. So yeah, that's where I'm at. Any advice on how to move forward from here would be greatly appreciated. Date. After the devastating shock of finding my sister Sarah with my now ex-boyfriend Tom, I spent several days in a daze, trying to make sense of what had happened. My phone was constantly buzzing with messages and missed calls from both of them, and from my parents, but I just couldn't bring myself to reply. I was too overwhelmed, too hurt. Eventually though, I realized that Mark, Sarah's fiancé, was one person who definitely deserved to know the truth. With a heavy heart, I made the tough decision to call him. When Mark answered, I could hear the confusion in his voice. He asked what was going on, mentioning that Sarah had been a total mess, saying I disappeared and wasn't answering anyone. Taking a deep breath, I started to explain everything to him. I told him about the suspicions I'd had at first, how everyone, including Tom and Sarah, had dismissed my concerns, and then I described in detail the scene I'd witnessed in my parents' garden. Mark listened quietly, not interrupting, only occasionally making a small sound to let me know he was still there, taking in everything I was saying. When I finally finished, there was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. Then, in a controlled, measured voice, Mark simply thanked me for telling him, adding that he needed some time to process this information. With that, he hung up. Afterward, I sat there, staring blankly at my phone, wondering what Mark would do now that he knew the truth. As the wedding day drew near, I heard nothing more from him or from the rest of my family. Sarah had stopped trying to reach out, and I started to suspect that she had somehow convinced Mark to forgive her. The thought that she might actually get away with her actions, that she could go on to have her picture-perfect wedding while my life was in ruins, made me feel physically sick. I realized there was no way I could attend the wedding. The idea of watching Sarah walk down the aisle, knowing what she had done, was unbearable. Instead, I decided to spend that day alone, focusing on how to rebuild my life after such a huge betrayal. On the evening of the wedding, I got an unexpected call from my cousin, Emma. There was a clear tone of excitement and urgency in her hushed voice as she said, "Oh my God, you won't believe what just went down." Confused and intrigued, I asked her what she meant. Without missing a beat, Emma launched into her story, recounting the events that had unfolded. She explained that everything had seemed normal at the start. Sarah had looked gorgeous in her wedding dress, and Mark had been standing at the altar, ready for the ceremony to begin. But when it came time for the vows, Mark had unexpectedly stepped forward and announced he had something to say. My heart started pounding as I listened to Emma describe the scene. Mark, in front of everyone, declared that he couldn't go through with the wedding. He told the guests he couldn't marry someone who had betrayed her own sister and wrecked her life by getting involved with her boyfriend. Emma continued, recounting how Sarah had turned completely pale at Mark's words. Then, to everyone's shock, Mark turned to my parents and apologized, telling them they needed to know the real reason why I had distanced myself from the family. Emma went on to say that Sarah had burst into tears. My parents had been left stunned and confused, and the guests had started whispering among themselves, trying to make sense of it all. Mark had then walked out of the church, leaving Sarah sobbing alone at the altar. It was like something out of a movie, Emma told me, her voice still laced with disbelief. Everyone's in shock. Your parents are trying to get the full story from Sarah, but she's a complete mess. As I sat there, taking in everything Emma had just told me, I felt a mix of emotions. On one hand, there was a sense of vindication, knowing that the truth had finally come out. But on the other hand, I couldn't help but feel a deep sadness for the pain and chaos this had brought upon my family. Emma, sensing my silence, gently asked, "Are you okay?" I'm not sure," I said honestly. I never wanted it to end like this. After chatting with Emma a bit more, I hung up and sat in silence, trying to process everything. Though at what cost, the truth was out. My relationship with Sarah was broken, my relationship with Tom was over, and now my whole family was in turmoil. I realized that even though the truth was now clear, it didn't instantly fix everything. Healing and rebuilding trust still lay ahead, a long and difficult road. But I felt a small sense of relief, for the first time since this whole ordeal began. At least now, I could start to move forward, free from the weight of the secrets that had been holding me back. As for what's next, I'm not sure. Although I know I'll eventually have to face my family, right now I'm taking things one day at a time. If nothing else, this experience has shown me the importance of trusting my gut and standing up for myself, even when others doubt me. To everyone who supported me through this journey, thank you. Your words of encouragement meant more than you know. And to anyone else in a similar situation, remember, trust your instincts, and don't let anyone gaslight you into doubting your own perceptions. Thanks for watching. If you haven't already, please subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more shocking real-life stories happening around you.